Hi, this is Ivan Velez, and I'm here to teach you about the history of comics. Back in the turn of the century, cartoons started popping up. Political cartoons, of course, by some pretty famous cartoonists like Winsor McCay, who's actually one of the first pioneers of animation, too. And political cartoons who talked about New York and America and the fat cats and the poor people. And one of the characters that became very popular was the Yellow Kid. Now, he's the first recurring comic book character in America. He kind of defines a comic book because he started appearing on covers. He started appearing in stories. And he became something popular that people look forward to. So he's pretty good. He was basically a street urchin, a kid who lived in the tenements in the poor area of New York, Lower East Side. A lot of the poor kids back then did not wear clothing every day. They just kind of wore their night shirts from the night before. Maybe they had a Sunday best or something like that. A lot of kids didn't even have shoes. That's how poor they were. So he's kind of representative of what was going on that day, particularly the division between rich and poor people. What a cute kid, huh? So yeah, there were a lot of cartoons around. Political cartoons, comic strips started popping up. And then the comic strips got bigger and bigger. They started becoming cinematic, telling bigger stories. You had the Sunday paper where they have the big, beautiful, colorful comic strips. And they became really popular. A lot of people were buying the newspapers just for the comic strips. And then someone had a good idea. Hey, why don't we put all the comic strips together and sell that by itself? Don't worry about the newspaper. Just put them all together, charge like 10 cents, and have a go at it. And guess what? That's how the American comic book was born. So you see these really beautiful, like Dick Tracy and Little Nemo became very, very popular. And they started supporting their own kind of like weekly comic books. The first ones were called the Funnies or Famous Funnies, where they would kind of put everything together. They were popular. They made a lot of money. And for 10 cents back then, that's pretty expensive. Back then, when you read comic books and comic strips, you were still pretty high class and kind of smart. That meant that you were educated and you could really enjoy like words and stories and kind of in-jokes and political ideas. Again, it was for comic strips back then were really, really for adults. But then adventures started happening. They started kind of copying the movies in the 30s. These great adventures, all this cinematic stuff going on, and it was reflected in the comic strips. And the Phantom was actually the first superhero. He kind of predated Superman by a few years. I remember my father telling me that he used to love the Phantom when he was a kid. And then, ta-da, this happened. Action Comics #1, where they started using superheroes for the first time. They used to have cowboy stories, adventure stories, night stories, Robin Hood stories. But the first time they started using kind of like science fiction and all these fantasy elements from like all the pulp magazines out there, the sci-fi elements, the dramatic kind of like mystery elements like the Shadow and, you know, all this fantasy magic and powers happening and these new heroes were popping up. And Superman was one of them. And Superman took a little while to get popular, but within a year, he was like the bestseller. And then everybody started copying, like this one, and these guys, and these guys. I mean, it was a great, great, great time for comics. Again, it became so popular. And with World War II coming up, all the heroes had to fight Nazis, and everyone was on their side, and they had something to do, and they needed, you know, because back then, the Great War, a lot of people were really, really kind of like worried about their families and the future and stuff like that. And reading comic books actually made them feel better because you had these heroes who were kind of making sure that the Axis and Hitler wouldn't win, that only they win. And with this fantasy kind of life, it made kids and other people kind of feel better about the situation. That was the golden age of comics. That's where so many different publishers just published so much, so many characters looking like Superman with capes and powers, men and women doing daring do, sidekicks, teams. It was just like a fabulous, fabulous time for some people because you notice that there weren't many people of color. And that's kind of a thing that happened in America since the beginning. A lot of people of color weren't allowed to be heroes on print. And even the fairy tales were kind of not allowed to show from other cultures. So what can you do? That's the way it was back then. So let's do some golden age characters, some 1940s kind of original style. Remember the superheroes were very angular back then, very simple. The printing was very simple. The colors were very simple. Plus the deadlines were crazy. Basically you had to draw like 20 pages by the end of the week and give it to the printer. Let's draw some 1940s golden age characters. Remember back in the early days of comics, the characters were very simple. a little bit crude too. The printing process was very kind of like in its early stages. You wanted to get it done. You wanted to get it kind of simple. You wanted to tell a real good story. And you took a lot of shorthands. Let's say if you join a character, remember the circle, right, for the head and the spine, okay? Think about making a very simple kind of like shorthand for like muscles, shorthand for like character. For instance, notice I did the chest, I did the stomach, and I'll do the triangle for the hip, okay? Now let me move that up a little bit just to make sure there's enough room. There we go. Now remember, I'm doing this on a digital tablet, probably gonna use paper and pen. Please do so. Remember when you draw in pencil, draw very lightly so they can erase. Actually, let me change that stance a little bit, because they tend to stand kind of heroic, right? Kind of very sure-footed. Shoulders, shoulders. So remember, you join the skeleton to kind of give yourself the basis for your character. So you know how they're standing. Remember the L, L. The reason why I do an L is to make the feet. Remember the L, this little angle right here is where the heel goes. You go towards the toe, and you go up, and that's the quickest way to draw a foot, okay? You can put all kinds of suits, soles, and, epaulets, and whatever kind of buckles you want to put on your boots, okay? Again, kind of like an L going this way. Remember this angle, that's the foot going up, make a quick toe, okay? You can even do that with heels if you want to, if you're making those classic superhero women, who, by the way, had a lot of heels back then. Now, remember that these superheroes were tough guys. A lot of them, because of the gangster movies, were very popular back then, and all these war movies. This whole idea of a guy being a guy, and I'm very macho. So you kind of think about making the character very simple, but they kind of stand very macho and brave, okay? Now, you notice I did the chest. Now, the hips. The hips, you got to go around the hips. Remember that. Don't make SpongeBob. Don't go like that, okay? Don't make chicken legs. You want to, because remember, we have, if this is our bones, we have muscles supporting the bone, okay? All right, again, when you go in from the middle, okay? And this is the knee. Remember, we have calves, okay? And shoes, again. Now, since there's a lot of very simple guys, ever since Superman kind of debuted and people were kind of copying his capes. By the way, capes were very popular even before Superman. We had like the Shadow and Magic the Magician, all kind of stuff. So capes were always kind of there. But when Superman wore it, it was kind of different. It was like a heroic kind of fantasy, science fiction, kind of adventure kind of thing. So capes became part of the normal costume of, of superheroes, okay? So, although there were a lot of people running around without capes too, they were more adventure types, all right? Think about something classic. Remember, military was very big back then. So, if you do military style, that's always a good way to go. I like belt buckles, okay? Gives them some kind of tool. A lot of them had like these corny little, like for instance, Green Lantern had that lantern. You can give them like a special kind of like weapon, okay? And by the way, the first weapons for a Batman was like a gun. Again, gangster movies were very big back then. All right, so boots are very important, and you take the eraser and you go in, okay? Now, when you ink, you want to make simple lines. You don't want to get too complicated. Right now, a lot of comic books are very beautifully done and very complicated and so much texture and beautiful lines. But that's, if you have a deadline, you can't really do stuff like that. All right, let's go for that cross. Remember that cross when you do a character where the line is higher, so it's cushion style cross, okay? Remember, very simple lines. They didn't have a lot of time to go into detail, so you want to make it simple, quick, make your lines there, make sure that they have something that's recognizable every time you draw the character. That's why capes were very popular, and cowls and all this kind of like masks, because you know that if you put the mask on, you don't have to worry about the facial features. Okay, so let's put a mask on this guy. And giving him a name. Now, the thing with drawing superheroes now, I always make it a person of color. The reason why is because there was a total lack of people of color back in the 40s. Let's give him some gear or something like that. Maybe he carries his magic, whatever. The colors were kind of very simple. Let's give him a giant T. Okay, for some reason. Yeah, symbols were very important. Remember, you have to recognize the character all the time. So if you give him a quick symbol like a bat or an S, you know it was a character. Okay. Now let's give him some hair. You can only give a cowl too. There was a lot of mystery characters back then. Just make them kind of simple. Okay. Now remember when you're drawing a face, this is the way you do sideways. Remember the chin is going to be here, so make sure you make room for the chin. Okay. Nose comes out. Mouth comes out a little bit, and the forehead comes out a little bit. Okay, so you notice that just by doing this, you kind of give yourself a character already. Remember, halfway between the circle and this is where the ear goes. If they have an ear, if you can see the ear, and also since they're very simple, the big thick lines, eyes, see that? Not so much detail. Right away, you have a character. Okay, that chin. A lot of times they had that jutting chin. Back then, that was like shorthand for like macho or masculine or heroic. So you always put that kind of like cleft chin. All right. Not too many people had cleft chins. Only kind of skinny people and stuff like that. And then you kind of do whatever you want. I like the mask, so let's just keep with the mask. This, I'll have his ears over here. Maybe the mask ties back here. Okay. And here. Now remember, if you're making a person of color, that's fine. I would make it like somebody in your family. Okay, so depending on what your family is or what kind of hair they kind of have, make that same thing in your character. Okay, because you know representation is very important, and I always would like to see myself reflected and my family reflected. All right, so that's kind of like the guy. If you're going to draw the women characters are a little different. The reason why is because sexism and Hollywood movies. Hollywood movies kind of, it's a circle again, the string, remember? Women were more fashionable back then. They had like the hair, the roller hair, you know, you put the hair in rollers and then you have these like weird curls and kind of a lot of hairspray kind of thing. So remember, chest, stomach. They're never as macho as even Wonder Woman was never as macho looking as the men. Women have their own kind of like aesthetic, okay? Even though they were mostly drawn by men, there were a few women in the comics industry back then. Ramona Fradon is one of like a really famous ones. If you want to look her up. Hips. But for the most part, it was men drawing the characters. And as time went on, men started drawing women more and more like pinup models, like, you know, like Marilyn Monroe or like all these bathing suit models. Very cute, very sexy, that kind of stuff. You don't want to do that all the time. Characters like Black Canary start showing their legs off. You know, Black Canary was actually kind of a cool character. They looked utilitarian. They looked like they could fight. Okay, there's eyes. Okay, nose, mouth. Okay, remember that, eyes, nose, mouth. With using that cross first. Okay, now let's make the body. Now they also have that fabulous hair. So you think about what kind of hair they have. They were looking at a lot of movie stars. The movie star just had that kind of big flowing hair. So a lot of that was going on in the characters. Okay, let's make her the same kind of like military kind of style. Even though back then women were not really allowed into the army, they had wax and waves, but they weren't really like infantry people or people, you know, on the war front. So maybe she's an exception. Maybe she's so powerful, like a Captain America, but a woman. Okay, she could still be Captain America too. All right, so let's give her a shield. I like that kind of idea of a woman fighting. Let's give her the star. Okay, you can call her something very, I don't know, Star Spangled Girl or something like that. Star Spangled Woman. Okay, let's give her like epaulets. Let's give it a thing like this. So you give this little kind of thing, put a little star here, little stripes, right? Make it very American, because that was a big thing back then, very patriotic. Remember they had a war, so it was always Americans versus the world. America is fighting the evil, that kind of stuff. And then those comic books sold. Okay, like that, like that. Let's give her a mask. Now remember that I made her a little tougher than a lot of those women were. They were drawn a lot of times very kind of like very pretty, very Hollywood kind of style. It got worse in the 50s where they were kind of like always the weak sister character. They're always very girly. They're always crying about boyfriends and that kind of stuff like that. But you don't have to make it like that. You can make it different. Let's give her. She probably would have a skirt, but if she's going to be fighting in the army, let's kind of like give her some fatigues or something, and some boots. Remember that L? I see I didn't do my own rule. The L helps kind of shape where the feet stand. Okay, and you can give her boots and stuff like that. A lot of the females in the 40s, the superheroes characters had heels for some reason. Again, because of the movies. So, but if you think about it, heels kind of get in the way, don't they? So you can add heels maybe as dress gear, but I would kind of focus on making something more comfortable for them to fight in. Okay, because remember, it's your character. Again, if you're going to draw your character from the side and the face profile, same rules as the men. Remember, the chin is here, the nose comes out, the forehead goes out, mouth comes out. Okay. Remember, a lot of times the 40s people had lipstick like crazy. Okay. Again, Hollywood style. All right. Again, with the eyes and the eyebrows, that kind of arching eyebrow they had in the movies. A lot of the heavy eyelashes was a big thing. And then if you're gonna do the mask, just can do the mask this way. Again, the ear, again, about 2/3 in. And then her hair has to be really big. Now, if you're gonna draw a woman of color, a lot of people had their hair like this too, because the processing was like a very big thing. The more you look like the Hollywood women, the better. But you can actually make a more appropriate style for the hairstyles in your family. Okay, and that'll be cool too. All right, she looks a little Latina, so I'm kind of giving her that kind of like my mom's hair back in the day. Okay, so that's how you do the women. What'd you think? Then comic books got so popular, they started branching out in different stories. You had crime stories, cowboy stories, love stories, science fiction stories, all these fantasy stories, stories for teenagers, stories for little kids, goofy cartoon stories. They're just stories everywhere, and it kind of play like their own version of Hollywood, where every type of movie was shown to different crowds. But things got a little crazy after that. Remember that most of the comic books were kind of marketed towards adults, to grown-ups. And with that in mind, things started going a little nuts. Batman and Robin used to kill people. Superman used to kill people. They used to throw people off the roofs. They used to do terrible, terrible things. A lot of times they were copying the gangster movies. Back in the day, they were very popular ones, you know, Scarface and Al Capone and all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of machine guns, a lot of bullet play. Batman's first weapon was a gun. Not only were the superhero stories violent, other stories became more and more violent. And because of that, and because of the political climate of the time, comic books got squashed. This guy wrote a book, Dr. Wortham, called Seduction of the Innocent. And basically he said that comic books were corrupting our youth of today, making them crazy, making them bloodthirsty, making them do horrible things. You kind of blame them for every bad thing in society. And while there were all these kind of really crazy violent stories, there was also like really cool comic books out there too. And all that beautiful new art and new kind of way of telling of stories were kind of changing, and it kind of got squashed. They made like a really big movement of getting rid of these comic books. They started having public comic book burnings. Comic books became very, 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 very restricted, very edited. So comic books changed. They weren't as free as before. They were kind of restricted, but some good stuff came out of it. A lot of stuff started being marketed towards kids now, which means that all these superhero stories and gangster stories and criminal stories and Western stories that were for grown-ups kind of changed, and they went straight to the kid market. Comic books started changing in America, and it became known as a child's thing to do. And popular heroes like Superman and Batman had to change. They became very kiddie friendly, more fantasy and science fiction, and kind of silly, kind of corny in a way. They had Super Monkey, they had Super Horse, Super Cat, Super Dog, Crypto, Super Teenagers from the Future, Super Imps from another universe, the Bizarro Superman. Everything was just kind of like very, very odd and weird, a little bit convoluted, but kind of fun, because this mythology just went crazy, and it just all these little tangents went here and there and there, and created this really big, rich universe. But it was mainly made for kids. Adventure Comics, Pep Comics, Casper. I mean, everything just became for kids. All comic books had to be marketed for kids, and they had to be squeaky clean. and that was considered the silver age of comics. Yeah, there was a lot of comics out there, a lot of different stories: Batman, Superman, Challenges of the Unknown. Really kind of interesting, but kind of bland stuff that kind of stayed one note, showing one kind of hero. No characters of color were allowed. Women was relegated to the kitchen. Even the female superheroes were very soft and weaker than their male counterparts. And it was just the way it was back then. It kind of mirrored the political climate of the time, the 50s, where people didn't talk about anything too controversial, that people wanted one way of life, that only one way was good. One type of person was good, and that's just the way it was. So that was the Silver Age. Meanwhile, in Japan, comic books back in the 50s were getting really, really interesting. You had Osamu Tezuka and Machiko Hasegawa. They were both like really, really super talented. Another cartoonist, of course, but he had his like famous Astro Boy or the Mighty Atom, Tetsuya Atan, who was like this little boy robot, kind of like the Pinocchio stories. It was very emotional, very fun, and it was marketed towards kids. You got to remember that Japan just went through a really horrible war. They lost. They lost a lot of people. They were the first place to get bombed by the nuclear bomb twice. The country was in ruins, and they needed something to kind of calm the kids down and just like entertain them while people try to rebuild. Machiko Hasegawa did this wonderful comic strip about a character who was a woman going through all the troubles that Japan was, and people followed her for many, many years. They loved this character, and she went through all the troubles that they did, and they felt like they can see them in their own lives kind of printed and represented on paper, which is such an important thing. This is something that America was lacking. We did not represent diversity. We only represented one type of person in America, while this comic strip represented every woman in Japan. And this little boy robot, every boy. And meanwhile, in America, the 60s were kind of changing things. You had comic books like Lobo. Lobo was a cowboy, an ex-slave who became a crime fighter and helped people who just asked for his help. And it was a great idea, and it only lasted a couple of issues, but the fact is they broke the wall there. They did something important that actually gave more people courage to do things. Like the Avengers and Spider-Man. Marvel Comics was coming up again. They were in the 40s and the 50s, but they didn't quite do as well as some of the other comic book characters. They kind of slept for a long time, and they revitalized the company with the Avengers #1, Amazing Fantasy, which featured Spider-Man for the first time, which was like a nerdy kid who actually got powers. It was something of the time. They used the language of the time. They used the kind of stories of the time. These stories were very personal. People felt connected to these characters in a different way. This felt more real, more realistic. Even though if you read them right now, they probably don't feel that realistic. But back then, they were a brand new thing. These comics changed the entire world. Black Panther, Black Lightning, all of a sudden you had diversity coming in. Now this is still kind of late. This came in like in the mid 60s. But remember that comic books reflect their times. And the civil rights movement was going on really strong. Martin Luther King was doing his work, Malcolm X, all these like wonderful people, wonderful leaders. And the Black Panthers was starting up too. And comic books kind of reflected that. People say that the X-Men were kind of a reflection of the civil rights era. Well, Black Panther was like right there. And Black Panther featured an African character, a black man who was not the sidekick of another superhero, was not a weak sister's character, but actually the leader of his own nation and the hero of his own book. That was pretty beautiful. Black Lightning kind of came after that. Black Lightning was actually created by an Italian man and an African-American young man who drew the first issues. People of color to kind of work in the industry. But what a wonderful combination right there. Then something amazing happened. Giant Size X-Men #1, kind of a reboot of the X-Men comic book that started in the 60s. It just blew me away. For the first time, you could see characters of color, different accents, different points of view, men, women, all sorts of folks, different ages. It was just like this wonderful, wonderful multicultural diversity that you had never seen before. And it was just amazing. And it became so popular that people couldn't wait for the next issue to happen. Of course, those very famous issues were made into movies and TV shows all the time. That's how powerful and groundbreaking they were back then. It was a fun time for comics because you had a lot of characters who looked a little funny, but it was a fun time for comics because there were a lot of characters who dressed according to the style of the 70s who we think look a little funny now, but back then they were kind of cool. First, of course, do the head. Heads like the balloon, the spine, right? Now we're thinking about superheroes in the 70s. So yes, they did have a lot of muscles back then. Back then, this whole bodybuilding craze was a big thing. People thought that if you were a male superhero, you had to have a lot of muscles. So that's kind of what they did. So remember, chest, stomach. You want to make that big box for the chest and the smaller box for the stomach. And then you do the little triangle here, okay? Hip, hip, shoulder, shoulder, okay? Now, shoulders. You can pose a character. I'm thinking I'm going to pose it classic, kind of like Halt. Who goes there? That kind of thing style. So shoulder, elbow, wrist. Shoulder, elbow, wrist, okay? Now, when you're thinking about people in the 70s, there was a debut of a lot, well, not a lot, but a few African-American characters. No Latino characters except for one white tiger in Marvel Comics. He was a Puerto Rican character in the black and white comics they did. The people who did the comics were not really schooled on how black people really were in the 70s or people of color. What they were using the reference were the movies, movies like Shaft, Coffee, Superfly. So a lot of those kind of images from the movies, unfortunately, a lot of the people, most of the people who did comics were not people of color. So sometimes it would sound a little fake or corny. For instance, Black Lightning was a wonderful character, actually drawn by a person of color, Trevor Von Eeden, which was very cool back then because, you know, there weren't that many people drawing in comics back then of color. But the person who wrote him used kind of like those references from the movies. So, you know, Black Lightning would have a fake afro at nighttime, and in daytime he would be a respectable teacher, take off his afro. Let's see, you're going to make him with muscles. For some reason, a lot of those superheroes back in the 70s kind of show their chest up, particularly black men. Don't know why, just kind of the way it was. Let's kind of avoid those kind of like tropes. And remember, tropes is something that keeps getting repeated over and over again. Like in movies, you know, like the superhero's girlfriend's always in trouble. That's a trope. Let's put a little triangle here, excuse me, rectangle, kind of for the hands, all right? This is the hip, this is the knee, again, ankle, okay? Now, see, make it a little thicker. Remember always kind of place where the knees are. Remember you are kind of going in from the middle. Again, I keep saying it over and over and over again. I'm going to repeat it 100 times. We're not SpongeBob. Our legs are not like popsicle sticks. We are actually one body that splits into two, okay? So you kind of have to make your body kind of split in the middle, kind of suggest where it reaches right there, and then put calf muscles, of course. Characters were very muscular. So if you're going to make it in the 70s, you might have to think about kind of 70s hair. Now, afros were coming in really big back then. So I want you to think about when you make a character, just give them that hair, that fabulous hair, that proud, happy kind of big hair. Okay, so I'm going to go this way. Now, of course, when you do your character, a 70s style character, I want him to look like somebody in your family, okay? Because the best way to represent somebody is to draw something that we're really familiar with. And, you know, we see our family every day. So let's give him a mask. Let's give him some powers. Try to avoid electric powers because for some reason, characters of color in particular have electric powers. A lot of them, Storm, Static Shock, you know, Black Lightning. This seems to be like a real thing. I think we have enough with electric powers. Maybe if you want to do something kind of interesting, heat ray powers maybe. Let's give us some interesting boots. Now, Buccaneer boots for some reason were a big thing, but if you want to do kind of flares like kind of like fake that disco thing, that's what Buccaneers were kind of big back then. Buccaneer boots are kind of like these old pirate style boots, but they had a flare which kind of matched the disco pants back then, the bell bottoms. All right, so think about the feet. What kind of symbol can we give this new character? I liked flare. I'm going to avoid the open chest because, again, that was a trope that was used with characters of color. Put a nice little collar in here. We can do military style. Let's go with, I like the military style from World War One. Kind of like that kind of style. Very, very official looking. And particularly the history of people of color when they fought in World War One, they were they were like heroes, especially in Europe. And that's a really big thing. So maybe that's like a legend there. I know I'm doing my own stuff based on that kind of stuff. Let's give him some gloves, because gloves are important back then. Let's give him maybe a weapon or a shield. I can give him a shield too. Why not? There we go. He's holding on a shield, a really big shield. And what else? I don't know. It looks kind of cool right now. But remember, he's going to go to clubs too at night. Here's a disco time. So that's kind of like a male version. Then you take the eraser and you erase. Remember, please, please, please press lightly with the pencil so you have time to erase, especially if you want to start inking, putting black markers or inks on top of it with brush or pens, because you want to be able to erase so that the pencil line when you need it, okay? A lot of times when I was doing comic books on my own, the erasing time was like really frustrating, and you had to do a lot of like whiteout back then, which is something we all used to use. Let's do like that. Let's call him Captain Courage. There we go. We kind of like the military kind of theme, right? Captain Courage, okay? Women characters, they had a few. Again, big hair was a really big thing. If anybody knows the Dazzler, she was like a disco queen. She came a little late in the game, but all right, head as a balloon. Remember that the string is going to be, her body's going to go around it, and you're going to be a little bit more lyrical with the women, a little bit more flow. Remember that when they used to draw men very kind of stiff sometimes, the poses were all about muscles and power, and women, they kind of were allowed to draw more feminine, more lyrical, like dancers instead of superheroes. Now, is that fair? Probably not, because, for instance, a character like Wonder Woman, who's a very powerful character, very strong, or She-Hulk. Well, She-Hulk was kind of exception because she was drawn more like a man. But Wonder Woman should be drawn a little stronger looking than she was. She was kind of like an underwear model, like so thin, and she looked like she could wear a bikini anytime, and her clothing was very revealing. So think about back then, they also revealed a little bit too much clothing in the women. I would avoid that. Remember, when you go to the chest, you go a little bit in, okay? Give it a little speck to the chest, and then you see the hips right there, you go around the hips, okay? Because remember, we have meat around it. We have all these muscles, all right, that support the bones. So you want to kind of do that as well, okay? Unless your character is really thin, that kind of happens too when they were very bony, but that's a character. It depends on what character, okay? Now, disco. You want to think about maybe big hair. I like the afro thing, okay? Afros are very good and very big. Kind of like that Angela Davis thing. But you know what? I like tiaras too, so I'm going to put a little tiara. And actually, earrings was a big thing back then. So even like the superheroes who could wear earrings. If anyone knows Storm from the X-Men, when she first came out, she had like these hip boots, which were very, very fabulous. I'm going to put hip boots on them. In fact, Storm, even though she revealed a little bit of skin, she had that cape that kind of was very kind of concealed a lot too. And she was just kind of fabulous and iconic. And it was totally influenced by the disco era. If I were you, I would Google Grace Jones and see how she dressed, and that's going to be a lot of inspiration for a lot of your characters. Let's do a circle here, circle here. So I want to do fists, okay? I like the idea of a woman having a shield too, some kind of shield. So let's put maybe a star shield. Now remember, these are rough sketches. They're supposed to be rough sketches. When you're making a character, you want to practice with them. You want to get comfortable with them. So when you make rough sketches, you have to give yourself room to make mistakes, to kind of draw something wrong, and you kind of play with them and kind of refine them until you get something you want. Back then, they had a lot of like cutoff costumes, which means they had like a tank top like that. I'm going to avoid that, only because it doesn't seem very functional to me. Okay, let's do kind of the version of that costume that I like on this guy. So she can also be a Captain Courage. Okay, maybe put a C here if you want to. So she still has that kind of flavor. I'm gonna put these hip boots that it matches her costume. Maybe she'll have some leggings here. Remember the feet, letter L, because the heel to the toe, and then you can go up, and that's a quick way to make a foot, okay? Now, of course, thigh-high boots are kind of like not very functional, but you know what? They're cute, so that's what matters. Erase this a little bit, erase some lines. Now, when you're doing face, remember that, again, they used to use a lot of eyeliner. This is a holdover from fashion days. In Hollywood, they used to put that kind of dark eyeliner and very, very rich lipstick. But now lipstick, depending on the character, is actually a point too. Remember when you color the lipstick, you might not want to use red all the time. You maybe there's some other colors you can use. If you're making a character of color, please be respectful. Draw features that are beautiful and just kind of like matches the person's ethnicity. Okay, if I made her Latina, I could still make her very dark skin. I could make her hair a little different, maybe a little thicker curls, just because that's the way Latinas look in my neighborhood. But think about where you live, who you're used to, what your family looks like, and make characters like that. So this is 70s characters. Of course, it can be any ethnicity, any nationality, but try doing somebody that looks like in your family, and look how cool they look. And I know that they can hear that music pumping, you know, that either disco music or hip hop, all right? Then the 80s happened. The 80s were more like the independent comic time, where people started kind of stretching their wings and kind of trying new things on paper. They could print themselves, like the Ninja Turtles were two guys who came together and just published their own comic books. The Hernandez brothers were these brothers who were like based in California, and they made these amazing, amazing comic books that still to this day are like considered the best in the world. On top of this new independent spirit, even DC Comics were allowing writers and artists to do more adult, mature versions of their characters, ushering in some really impressive writing, some really dark storylines, and some really, really adult fare that signaled to the audience out there that it was okay to read comics as an adult. Really the birth of the term graphic novel. Yeah, the 80s were pretty special back then. And then the 90s came, and man, the 90s kind of like blew up the industry big. The Death of Superman was this huge event where, for some reason, got a lot of like publicity on the TV that they were trying to kill off Superman, and all of a sudden, everyone started reading comic books. It was the age of speculation, where people were buying comic books to save for later and to maybe make more money off of. It was an investment. Companies took advantage of this and they printed multiple covers and special covers and glow-in-the-dark covers and moving covers to get more people to buy them as an investment. And the market did really well for a little while, particularly Death of Superman, which is like one of the biggest selling comic books ever. But it gave companies like Image and even Milestone a good kick in the beginning when it came in. And Milestone was really important because for the first time, a comic book company focused on characters of color, on superheroes of color, on diversity, on different orientation, and telling stories that matter to people of color. And I was very happy that I was part of that scene. Of course, these good times had to end. Most of these companies closed down. Even Milestone closed after 3 years. Marvel Comics fired 2/3 of their staff, cut 2/3 of their books. And it was just like a really dark time for comics that still we haven't really fully recovered from. But it made people think about who exactly are reading comics, who are they marketed towards, and can they continue the way they used to be, or do they have to kind of become something new? As you can see now, comics are different. We have a lot of diversity going on. A lot of people who are seeing themselves reflected in the comic books. You have Miles Morales, Twofer, who's black and Latino, as many people are. We have Batwoman, who's lesbian. You have like all these different things going on. You have all this new diversity coming in, and thanks to the Black Panther and Black Lightning and all of Milestone and Static Shock and all that kind of stuff, they kind of push the envelope back in the early days. It's because you demanded it. The readers were actually kids of all colors who made themselves noticed on the internet, on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on all these kind of like platforms, and their opinions started to count and matter. And all of a sudden, diversity became the true selling point. Kids are just like demanding this, and it is happening because of you. Meanwhile, in Japan, things are going big there. One Piece, Dragon Ball, Pokemon, all this kind of stuff going on, just building and building a global market, readers from all over the world, every different country, including America, to the point where right now, more people read Japanese comics than any other comics in the world. American comic books don't sell that well. They're too expensive. You're gonna get 20 pages of story for like $5. The diversity which is starting now wasn't there for a very long time. Some of the stories were not as great as they should have been. Yes, there's some great classics that are being made into movies and films, but you know what? People love that kind of dynamic and emotional content. Japan just like delivered like no one else did. And I think that a lot of things that we're learning from Japanese marketing and Japanese storytelling is coming to America and kind of changing the way we tell our stories too. Comics these days are totally different. They're online, they're digital. You see them on their phone, on your tablet, on your PC, on your laptops. They don't have to make that much of a profit anymore. They are jumping points for other media, for movies, for films, for animation, for soap operas. Yeah, comics have changed. And I wonder what they'll be like 10 years from now, even. And that basically was the history of comics. So thanks for joining me today. Keep drawing, keep reading, keep enjoying. And I hope I see you next time when we try to make a better world through comic books. Ciao.